after the Taoiseach course.
I travelled to Brussels on the 4th of October for a series of meetings with the staff of the EU institutions ahead of an important phase in negotiations on the EU-UK withdrawal agreement. I met with the new President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, Chief EU Brexit negotiator, Micheál Barnier, the Chair of the European Parliament Brexit Steering Group, Guy Verhofstadt. At all three meetings, I said that we wanted the future relationship between the EU and the UK to be as close, comprehensive and ambitious as possible, but that it was essential that a legally robust backstop is set out clearly in the withdrawal agreement. I expressed my appreciation for the ongoing efforts of Mr Barnier and his team in the negotiations with the United Kingdom, and thanked all my interlocutors for their robust solidarity with Ireland. The EU proposals outlined in the draft protocol early this year are practical solutions to protect the gains of the peace process and to keep the border open and invisible as it is today. They represent no threat to the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom. We want to see a future relationship between the EU and the UK agreed that makes the backstop unnecessary once the period of transition ends. However, that outcome cannot be guaranteed. The backstop must therefore be in place as part of the Irish protocol to offer full confidence that in all circumstances there will be no return to a hard border in Ireland. My interlocutors reaffirmed their solidarity with Ireland and reiterated their strong view that the UK is under an obligation to deliver on the clear commitments and guarantees that Prime Minister May gave in December and again in March and September, if there is to be a satisfactory withdrawal agreement, including provision for a transition period to the end of 2020. I can assure the House that these and other reassurances of solidarity that I receive in private are every bit as robust as those being voiced in public. EU backing has been unwavering. Ongoing political engagement with our partners, of course, remains crucial, and I'll continue to take every opportunity to ensure that our partners fully understand our particular concerns in order to enable the best possible outcome for this country. I saw Donald Tusk and Micheál Barnier again, along with my fellow members of the European Council, at our most recent summit in Brussels on the 17th and 18th of October. I've seen President Tusk twice since then at our party conference in Helsinki, and recently saw President Tusk and President Juncker. That was in Helsinki, and President Juncker in Paris.
Thank you, Taoiseach, for your reply. And it's fair to say that there's been an enormous amount of coverage of the Brexit negotiations over the last while and at the moment, but still very little hard detail in terms of what's agreed. Now, obviously, the practice of ongoing commentary caused a lot of problems over the last year, and it's understandable that the European Union side, at least, is determined to allow maximum room to manoeuvre for the discussions. And I think there's a desire to try and create some space to allow people to engage in negotiations without megaphone diplomacy. I think it's quite noteworthy that Tony Connolly's piece last Saturday suggested that our ministers were asked to stop constantly commenting and making political points during the latest phase of discussions. From what we can see, Taoiseach, it's clear, or it seems to be, that there is a deal on the table. But the issue really is the choreography of that deal in London and how it gets organised in Britain. The London government has secured its main objective of having a buffer of access to the customs union until it is ready for an alternative to seeking to maintain control of when it should exit this particular union. Now, may I say in passing, I think Britain staying in the customs union is good for Ireland. That needs to be said, because I think there's been a lamentable lack of focus on the east-west axis. Our trade with Britain is absolutely critical here, and therefore that idea of Britain staying in the customs union is one that should be encouraged. Obviously, for a much, much longer term than maybe some in the British Parliament would want. In relation to the Northern Ireland specific element of the deal, the British Attorney General is reported as being prepared to argue that the wording is flexible, that the withdrawal treaty is by definition not capable of permanently binding the United Kingdom, and that the backstop is capable of coming to an end if the United Kingdom desires it too. As you know, Taoiseach, due to a motion which is currently before the UK House of Commons, it is likely and was likely that the legal advice of the AG in Britain would be made available, and my understanding is the government in Britain has now decided in the last while to make their legal advice available to the House of Commons. Now, I know our own Attorney General has been to Brussels last week to examine the proposed wordings. There's a very real possibility, Taoiseach, that we'll have a situation of one wording on the backstop but two directly contradictory legal interpretations of what it means. So it's entirely conceivable that the United Kingdom government will insist that they can end the backstop unilaterally without our government, while our government would say it can't. So we may have an agreement with multiple interpretations of what that agreement actually means. Taoiseach, will you give us an assurance that you will make available to this House at very least the same level of information as will be made available to members of the United Kingdom Parliament? In essence, the legal advice. We can't have British parliamentarians having more information available to them as than would be available to Irish parliamentarians. If there is a deal, Taoiseach, will you commit to delivering full information on the legal implications? Will you also commit to publishing an immediate update of economic forecasts of the implications of what is agreed? As you know, Brexit already has had an enormous, significant economic impact on Britain and on Ireland. I think we have a right to know what the best estimates are for its future impact while agreements are being discussed, and not just after they have been implemented.
Deputy Boyd Barrett to table question 5.
Yeah. Taoiseach, I want to ask, in your discussions with your European colleagues, have you been raising the issue of Palestine, and in particular in the context that the European Union this year has the chair of the Kimberley process, which is the certification process for the diamond industry, for the export of diamonds, and Ireland specifically has the chair of that process between the 12th and the 16th of November. And one of the key aspects of Kimberley is to not allow, to prevent, prohibit or ban the export of blood or conflict diamonds. Now, Palestinian activists and civil society have been calling for the Kimberley process to include conflict diamonds coming from Israel in the Kimberley process of prohibited goods, on the grounds that Israel is engaged in ongoing systematic abuse of human rights. Most recently, obviously, launching a bombing raid in Gaza, killing 5 people. That followed a covert Israeli military operation on Sunday that killed 7 Palestinians and followed the killing of 4 Palestinians only a few weeks before that, and over 200 Palestinians in Gaza since the Great March of Return this year. So should we not now use a power that we will have in our hands as chair of the Kimberley process to call Israel out and to impose a sanction on Israel which could actually impact on them, to demand that they will not be allowed to carry on this very lucrative diamond trade if they continuously deny and suppress basic Palestinian rights and wantonly kill Palestinian people in their fairly brutal oppression of the Palestinian people at large.
Deputy McDonald.
Last I want to echo Deputy Boyd Barrett's concerns for the current state and the ongoing state of siege and breaches of international law by the state of Israel. Taoiseach, to return to the issue of Brexit and the imminent deal, we've had several waves of discussion and negotiation around the Irish protocol and the Irish question. And of course, the initial position of the British government, notwithstanding commitments that they entered into previously, was to say that they contested the notion of the need for a specific backstop for Ireland. So we came through that discussion around the scope of it. People held steady, government and others, in an insistence that as a matter of an insurance policy, the north of Ireland is not as British as Finchley. We have particular concerns, particularly Irish needs that need to be met, and therefore a bespoke solution and insurance policy was required. Then we moved on to the issue of duration of a backstop. And of course the tension emerged between the British demand for something that would be temporary and an Irish demand for something that would be enduring. And it was put by very many of us right across this House that temporary protections really aren't protections at all. And I understood that we were all on the same page on these matters. I know for sure that in our dealings with the British government, with Micheál Barnier, Verhofstadt and others, we certainly went to very great lengths to reiterate that position, the position that we understood to be commonly held across the Irish political landscape. And then you started to talk about a review clause and a review mechanism. And I am deeply troubled by that. I'm puzzled by that. I'd like you to explain what that is. I'd like you to identify the provenance of it. And I'd like you to consider this, Taoiseach. Firstly, any review clause or mechanism, this state and whoever is in government will not be a direct party to such a review. Secondly, even thinking out loud about the concept of a review offers to the Tories in Britain the prospect of these being temporary little arrangements. Let me assure you that that is how they will view matters. And thirdly, we had all talked about achieving stability and certainty for our politics, for our society and for our economy. Review mechanisms, by definition, prolong uncertainty. I think you were wrong to raise this matter. I want to know, have you conceded that point of a review mechanism? Is a review mechanism, clarify for us, is that part of the deal that's on the table? For the life of me, I don't understand why you have shifted substantively the position of the Irish government at this point in the negotiation. Have you seen review wording? Has the Attorney-General, as Deputy Martin suggests, similarly viewed words that constitute a review clause? Why did you agree to that, if you have agreed to it? If you have not, then why were you thinking out loud along these lines? I put it to you, Taoiseach, that you've asked a time when clarity of purpose, singularity of focus, steadiness, steady, sticking to the bottom line needs of this country was required. You have rather wavered from that, and I think that your words and your actions in that regard are very, very dangerous.
Deputy Brendan Howlin.
Thank you, Lescan Corla. Taoiseach, in the normal course of events, EU policy decisions are taken obviously at EU level, and member states get a significant time to digest them and to implement them locally. In these negotiations now, unfortunately, we've moved into what is classic brinkmanship. All of the hard decisions being left to the final hours. Negotiators were hearing up to 3 in the morning and resuming at dawn and negotiating in the so-called tunnel. Everything is now urgent. There's little time left for information to be released and digested and analysed. So, like others, Taoiseach, I want to make it clear that we need time to see specifically the structure, the content and the import of any withdrawal agreement, and to make sure that we are legally clear before we vote in this House on any of these matters. So can I ask you, Taoiseach, will you make officials of the government available to us to brief us, members of the House and parties across the House, once the agreement is finalised, if it is finalised, and provide us with any legal interpretation that the government is relying upon? Can I ask in relation to, because I agree with the point made by Deputy Martin that the East-West part of the equation is extremely important for us. And I say that not only as leader of the Labour Party, but as somebody who represents Wexford and the port of Rosslare. East-West trade is extremely important to us. And of course, a UK-wide customs union would be a great advantage. but it must be a permanent basis, and I can't, for the life of me, see how that could be acceptable to the UK authorities. But we will see what is on offer, what is acceptable to Britain when the time comes. Can I ask you, just in relation to the review mechanism that was mentioned, and I asked you about this last week, you gave me some answers in relation to it. I think maybe more has been made of this than it merits, but I think we need clarity in relation to it, and perhaps you would give us that clarity now. Have you discussed a review mechanism with Michel Barnier, and what is your understanding of the term and what is meant by it? And finally, the report today in relation to the common travel area, and I've had discussions with a number of people in relation to this matter. Some legal advice I've got is not to try to codify the common travel area, because once you start legally framing it, you actually are maybe in some ways reducing the right space of it. But my fear has been that a lot of what we understand as the common travel area, which is a very, I suppose, shallow term for a very broad range of rights enjoyed by Irish citizens in the UK and UK citizens here, right down to access to health services, education, housing, the right even to vote, that if we had an acrimonious parting of Britain, and if it was perceived by the British, or certainly by the Tory government, that the Irish issue was at the heart of the reason for an acrimonious departure, then rights enjoyed that are not legally codified and agreed may well disappear. Now, I know in private briefings there has been discussions in relation to this, but perhaps you would put on the record of the Dáil what exactly is the extent of negotiations in relation to the rights of Irish citizens and British citizens here, which, separate from our European Union rights, would endure in what we now know to be or call the common travel area.
Deputy Joan Burton, who has tabled questions 8 and 9.
Thank you. I want to ask you, Taoiseach, about the backstop at this point in time. Have you seen legal drafts of the backstop? Has Mr Barnier proposed such a legal paper or draft which has been shown to you, or indeed to Irish officials or other representatives? Do you believe, as Taoiseach, that you still have bulletproof proposals on the backstop? And what is now your desired deadline in relation to agreement on Brexit? Is that the December Council meeting, or is it later than that again? I'd also like to ask you whether or not you agree that the Good Friday Agreement changed the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. And I would like if you could expand on how that has affected your discussion with both Mr Barnier and Mr Tusk, and whether or not you agree that it is almost inevitable that if Brexit proceeds along the lines we understand at the moment, that there will be a constitutional crisis in the UK, specifically in relation to Scotland, who have voted against, but who have no power at all in terms of the negotiation, while in the north here we have no functioning executive to represent in a legitimate way the views of the different parties and communities and traditions in Northern Ireland. And it looks like we're drifting inevitably, and I think I said this ages ago, to the last few hours of the last night of negotiations. So I'd really encourage you to be forthcoming to the Dáil in what is a most important decision for everybody on the island of Ireland, for the EU, and obviously for the UK. as to where you think it stands now. Cut out the spin and just tell us where you think it's at the moment.
Can I Taoiseach to respond?
Thanks very much. That's quite a lot of questions there. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can in the time permitted. The negotiations are happening in private. They're happening in the tunnel and they're happening in private for a very good reason. And I've always said throughout these talks over the past year and a half that it wasn't helpful to give a running commentary on negotiations. It's certainly not in our national interest to do that. And that's particularly true when you approach a very sensitive phase. And I feel we are approaching a very sensitive phase now. So I hope deputies will understand why I need to be a little bit cautious in the way I answer questions. But I am very happy to make officials available for confidential briefings with the party leaders and their teams this week, and also should we come to the point where we have an agreement, and I'd be very happy for that to happen, and I'll ask my officials to contact leaders' offices to set that up as soon as possible. I think Deputy Martin is absolutely correct to say that the UK staying in a customs union for a time, or staying in a temporary customs arrangement, would be beneficial for Ireland because of the benefits of frictionless trade east-west between Britain and Ireland, which is so important for the agri-food sector and so important for our SMEs as well. And also very important for Northern Ireland, because let's not forget that much of the trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain actually goes through Dublin Port and Rosslare. It is the quickest way to get from Northern Ireland to the Midlands and the south of England. It's not Lawrence Stranraer and all the way down, it's Dublin to Rosslare and across the way to England. So I would hope business in Northern Ireland will see the benefits of the UK staying aligned to the customs union. In terms of legal interpretation, again, I think Deputy Martin makes a very valid point. There have been some discussions on this already. We want to avoid a situation whereby we have an agreement that is made, and then 2 or 3 days later you have the European Union interpreting it differently to the UK. So that's something we are aware of, and some consideration has been given to making sure that we have a common legal interpretation, if you like, of the agreement whenever it comes. Yeah, there is a difference there. I'll make everything available to the Dáil that I can, but there is a difference there. Bear in mind, this is, and we are talking about legals here and legal advice here, this is an EU-UK agreement. It's an agreement between the EU and the UK, not an agreement between the UK and Ireland, or the UK, EU and Ireland. It requires ratification by Westminster, requires ratification by the European Parliament. So the UK Attorney General is in possession of his own legal advice. The European Union legal advice is in the ownership of the European Commission Legal Service and the European Council Legal Service. So I think it is very likely that they will make that available to all of us, but it will be made available to all of the European Parliaments, not just specifically our own. In relation to Palestine, yes, Palestine and Israel is regularly raised at European Council meetings, most recently around the status of Jerusalem, where the European Union was absolutely united in our view that that embassy should not be moved to Jerusalem until the final status of that city is decided. On the Kimberley process, Deputy Boyd Barrett raised this before. I've actually written to you about it. I'm not sure if you've received that letter yet, and that explains why it doesn't apply to Israel and why what you propose cannot be done in view of the people who know all about the Kimberley process. Palestine was also discussed as well last week in Helsinki at the EPP Congress, where there's a discussion around the Human Rights Watch report. It's one worth being familiar with, and that's a report on human rights in Palestine. I can't remember the exact title, but I think it's Two Administrations, Same Oppression, and talks about the extent to which Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza face oppression by both Hamas and the Palestinian authorities. And I think it's important that when we talk about the conflict in Israel and Palestine, we don't turn a blind eye to the human rights abuses being committed by Hamas and by the Palestinian Authority. I think sometimes it seems that if a Palestinian is a victim of human rights abuses by Israel, it's raised, but when they're a victim of human rights abuses by Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, there's silence. And I just hope that you don't have a higher level of tolerance for human rights abuses committed by Hamas or Palestinian groups than are committed by the State of Israel, because you never mention them, and I just thought I'd put that on the record. In relation to Deputy McDonald's questions on the backstop, I think it's always important to remember the joint report in December, which set out options A, B and C. Option A, avoiding a hard border through the future relationship. Option B, specific solutions proposed by the UK. Option C, which is the backstop. So we should never forget that this is intended to be a backstop. It is intended never to be invoked. It is intended that if it is ever invoked, it should only be temporary as a bridge to an option A or an option B. But it does have to be there. It has to be legally operative, and it cannot have an expiry date, and it cannot be cancelled by one side unilaterally. And that is the position we've had consistently all the way through. But we should always bear in mind what the outcome is, what the objective is, and that is to avoid the emergence of a hard border on our island, and understand that that's the objective, whether it's a double backstop or a backstop to the backstop or a hybrid backstop. That's not the point. The point is having a legally binding guarantee that a hard border will not emerge between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I know that Micheál is very hostile to the review clause, and I just don't agree with that position. We often have review clauses in treaties, we often have review clauses in legislation. I have no doubt that if Deputy Micheál was leading the negotiation, she would have walked away by now. Over the review clause, we would have no deal, just as we have no deal in Northern Ireland. I'm adopting a different approach, which is being willing to consider creative solutions, which is being willing to consider creative solutions, being willing to consider creative language where necessary. And I met Mark Durkin at the inauguration last night, or on Sunday night. And one thing he reminded me of was the fact that the Good Friday Agreement has a review clause. And that was part of the Good Friday Agreement, understanding that if you want an agreement to last, if you want it to be long-standing, if you want to have an agreement that's enduring, it makes sense to build into it review mechanisms. So that was his understanding of it, which I thought was very wise. It's not there is no review clause yet. It's a proposal that's been put forward. It's under consideration. So I can't describe something that doesn't exist yet. It's been put forward by the UK side, and we've been very clear that we're willing to consider a review clause, but we're not willing to consider a backstop that can be unilaterally terminated by one side.
Taoiseach, please.
I'm just every time we try to have a serious discussion about Brexit, I'm just more and more convinced that there would be no deal if Sinn Féin was leading these negotiations. It is just so evident that this uncompromising, extreme approach. If we're going to have an agreement between the UK and the EU, you actually have to be willing to be generous on occasion. You have to be willing to give them something, so long as you maintain your objectives and get your outcomes. This approach that Sinn Féin would pursue would ensure that we would have no friends in Europe, that there be no deal with the UK.
Okay, thanks. We've taken up two